All right, so today we're really diving deep, going back to the roots of economic thought with David Ricardo and his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, published way back in 1817. It's, well, let's just say it's had a lasting impact. If you're looking to cut through some of the denser stuff and get to the core of what Ricardo was arguing, well, I think you've come to the right place.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that Ricardo wasn't working in a vacuum, right? He was engaging with some of the biggest names in economics at the time. Think Adam Smith, Jean-Baptiste, even sparring a bit with Thomas Malthus. So we'll see how he takes their ideas, builds on them, and yeah, sometimes critiques them pretty sharply.
It's fascinating to see how these ideas were developing, right? And Ricardo's Principles, it's a pretty comprehensive work, covers value, taxation, all sorts of things. Apparently, he'd initially thought about splitting it up, maybe having a whole separate book on taxation, but in the end, it all came together in this one massive work.
Yeah, and I think there was some expectation from James Mill, a close friend of Ricardo's, that there would be this standalone dissertation on the principles of taxation. But it ended up being woven into this larger text.
So our goal here is to really pull out those key insights, those golden nuggets, if you will, from Ricardo's work. There's a lot to unpack. And frankly, some of it is still pretty relevant today, even surprising in its foresight. Ready to get started.
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
So right off the bat, Ricardo jumps into this whole question of value. And his big argument is that the value of a good, what makes it worth trading for something else, boils down to the amount of labor it took to produce it. It's like this core idea that underpins his whole system.
Right. And I think it's important to note that Ricardo himself recognized that this wasn't some kind of ironclad law, right?
Hmm.
There are other things that come into play, like the durability of the tools and machinery used in production, what we call capital goods. But by and large, he saw labor as this primary driver of value.
So, like, if you had a hunter who spent a day catching a deer and a fisherman who spent the same amount of time catching two salmon, you'd expect that one beer would be worth about two salmon in a trade. It's this natural exchange rate based on the labor involved, regardless of how much each of them is getting paid per hour.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And then you start adding in things like fixed capital, machines, tools, that sort of thing. And it gets a bit more complex. Imagine you've got two machines that are both used to produce corn, but one is way more durable than the other. Well, the corn that's made using the more durable machine, that's going to become relatively more valuable over time, especially when profits are high, because you're not having to put as much labor into constantly replacing or repairing that machine.
Ricardo also looked at gold, as this potential standard of value, a way to measure everything else against. But he ran into a bit of a problem there, didn't he?
He did, because gold, just like any other commodity, it requires labor to mine it, refine it, the whole process. And those processes can change. They can become more or less efficient, just like with anything else. So even gold, as useful as it is for trading, isn't a perfect measure of value across the board.
So it's still this labor question that's really at the heart of it. Even if it's not perfectly straightforward, the fluctuations in the amount of work it takes to make something, that's what's really driving changes in prices. And Ricardo, he also made this interesting distinction between different stages of economic development, right?
Right. He talked about how in earlier stages of society, the value of goods was often pretty closely tied to the amount of capital that you had invested in making them. But as societies develop, you get these more complex systems with machinery, specialization, and all of a sudden you can have situations where you've invested the same amount of capital in two different things, but the value of what you produce ends up being quite different. So it's not just a simple one-to-one relationship anymore.
And wages, right? There's this whole thing about how a rise in wages can have different effects depending on what's causing it. It's not always as simple as prices just going up across the board.
Exactly. If wages go up just because the value of money itself has changed, like we have inflation, then yeah, you'll see prices increase generally. But that doesn't necessarily mean that profits are taking a hit. It's more like everything's just being measured on a different scale.
Yeah.
But if wages rise because, say, the cost of food and basic necessities has gone up, well, that's a different story.
Because then the workers need more to just get by,
Right.
right? So a bigger chunk of what's being produced is going towards just supporting them, which means less is left over for profit. And that can lead to all sorts of knock-on effects.
And Ricardo really emphasizes that point. It's this kind of fundamental tension in the system. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about rent. Ricardo's got some pretty specific ideas about how that works. He argues that rent arises because land isn't all created equal, right?
Some land is more fertile, some is better located for transportation or markets, all sorts of things. So naturally, the land that's got those advantages, it's going to be more productive, it's going to yield more. And that extra yield, that's what creates rent.
And here's a key point that people often misunderstand. Ricardo doesn't see rent as something that's added on to the price of agricultural goods, like corn. He sees it as a consequence of the price, which is determined by the cost of production on the least fertile land that's still being cultivated, the land that's just barely good enough to make it worth farming. On that marginal land, there's no rent being paid.
But on the better land, there's this surplus, this extra value being created, and that gets captured as rent. And Ricardo even goes so far as to say that if other things in nature, things that we usually think of as free, like air or water, if those were suddenly scarce and could be owned, they'd also generate rent. It's about this fundamental principle of scarcity and the value that arises from it.
Right? It's not just about land being special, it's about any resource that becomes limited and can be controlled. Now, as the population grows and the demand for food, especially corn, increases, well, you got to start cultivating that less fertile land.
Yeah.
And that pushes up the cost of production for everyone, which means the price of corn goes up. And as the price goes up, so does the rent on that more fertile land.
Yeah.
And guess who ends up paying for it?
The consumers. It's not the farmers who are suddenly getting squeezed. It's the people buying the corn who are feeling the pinch. And that brings us to profits. Ricardo argues that there's this inverse relationship between wages and profits, like they're on opposite ends of a seesaw.
Exactly. Think of the total value produced by a farmer as this pie. It's got to be divided up between the wages paid to the workers and the profits that the farmer keeps. If one slice gets bigger, the other has to get smaller. And according to Ricardo, over time, there's this tendency for profits to decline. And the culprit is, you guessed it, rising wages.
Because as the population grows, it gets harder and harder to produce enough food and other necessities. You've got to start using that less fertile land, which means costs go up and wages have to rise just to keep pace. And that eats into profits. It's like this relentless pressure on the system. Now, of course, in the real world, things aren't always so neat and tidy.
Right. You'll see market prices fluctuating all the time based on short-term changes in supply and demand. So you might have some industries where profits are booming for a while and others where they're really struggling. But Ricardo's argument is that over the long haul, capital will tend to flow towards those more profitable sectors, eventually evening things out. It's all about finding that equilibrium.
Now, let's talk about foreign trade. Ricardo believed that trade was generally a good thing. It increased the overall amount of stuff, the mass of commodities, as he called it, that a nation could enjoy. But he also made this interesting distinction between the quantity of goods and their value.
Right. Just because you're bringing in more stuff from abroad doesn't necessarily mean that you're creating more value within your own country. The value is still ultimately tied to the amount of domestic labor and domestic products that are being exchanged for those imports. Think of it like this. Imagine a merchant who's importing wine. They invest a certain amount of capital, and let's say they can either buy a lot of cheap wine or a smaller amount of really fancy wine for that same investment. The quantity of wine they import might be very different, but their profit, as a percentage of their capital, remains the same.
It's all about the underlying value of what's being exchanged. Now, of course, trade can get complicated when you have imbalances between countries, when one is consistently exporting more than it's importing.
Right, and that can lead to flows of precious metals, gold and silver, moving between countries to settle those accounts. And those flows can then affect the relative value of money in those different places. But Ricardo argued that even with all that going on, the value of money is never going to be perfectly equal between any two countries.
Because you've got all these other factors at play, right? Different tax systems, different levels of skill and technology in their manufacturing. Even differences in climate can affect how efficiently things are produced. It's a complex system. And speaking of complex systems, let's talk about taxation. Ricardo had a lot to say about that, and some of it might surprise you. He argued that the real burden of taxes, in the long run, it falls on capital, not on wages.
Right, because if taxes reduce the amount of spending that's going towards productive investment, building new factories, developing new technologies, without a corresponding decrease in non-productive spending, well, then the overall pool of capital available for growth shrinks, and that can have a ripple effect throughout the economy.
And he looked at all sorts of different types of taxes, right? Taxes on agricultural produce, taxes on rent, taxes on profits, even taxes on wages. And each one has its own unique set of consequences. A tax on farm products that's likely to push up the price, which will benefit landowners who collect rent. A tax specifically on rent, well, that's pretty straightforward. The landlords are the ones who feel the pinch there. But a tax on profits, that can really discourage investment and slow down economic growth.
And what's interesting is that Ricardo argued that a tax on wages, it doesn't actually hit the workers as hard as you might think, because ultimately it gets passed on either through higher prices or lower profits, and it effectively becomes a tax on capital again.
He also waded into the debate about the poor laws, which were the system of providing relief to the poor in England at the time, and he had some pretty strong opinions about how they should be managed. He worried that if they weren't carefully controlled, they could end up consuming a big chunk of the nation's income without actually solving the problem of poverty.
Right, he thought that systems that were managed locally, at the parish level, were more likely to be effective and less prone to abuse than a big, centralized national fund. And he also pointed out that a tax on income, it can actually distort the relative prices of goods depending on how much capital is involved in making them. If you've got a product that requires a lot of expensive machinery and equipment to produce, well, a tax on income isn't going to increase its price as much as it would for a product that's mostly made with labor.
Because that tax is hitting a smaller proportion of the overall cost. Interesting. And he also talked about taxes on things like gold and houses and how those tend to end up being borne by the owners of those assets.
Right, because if the tax pushes up the price, demand will usually fall. And if the supply of those things can't be quickly reduced, well, the owners are stuck with the bill. It's all about how quickly the market can adjust. And then there are bounties, government subsidies on exports, which were a big deal in those days. Ricardo argued that these could temporarily boost the price of the subsidized goods, but only until the supply caught up.
But if you have a sustained bounty on something like corn, a staple food, that can have some pretty long-lasting effects. It can lead to more and more land being brought under cultivation, even if it's not very fertile, just to chase those higher prices. And guess what happens? Rents go up, and the price of corn stays high even after the bounty is gone. It distorts the whole market.
It really does. Now, one of the most important distinctions that Ricardo makes is between value and riches. He's not just using these words interchangeably. Riches, for him, it's about the abundance of goods, the sheer quantity of stuff that people have to enjoy.
Whereas value, that's all about the labor that goes into producing those goods. It's a much more fundamental measure in his view.
And what's fascinating is that he argues that an increase in the efficiency of production, technological advancements, better organization, all that stuff, it leads to greater riches, no doubt. You can produce more with the same amount of effort.
But it also has this paradoxical effect of decreasing the value of the goods that were produced before that efficiency improvement. Because those older goods, they embody more labor, which has now become relatively more expensive because you can produce so much more with it. It's a mind-bending concept.
It really is. And Ricardo was very skeptical of the idea of finding some perfect standard of value, whether it's gold, corn, or even labor itself. Because all of those things, their conditions of production can change, which means their value can fluctuate. He kept coming back to this idea that it's the cost of production, the real effort that goes into making something that's the ultimate driver of its value in the long run.
Not just how useful people think it is or how much they happen to want it at any given moment. And that brings us to this whole question of capital accumulation and machinery, a topic that was already causing a lot of anxiety back in Ricardo's day.
Right, and he understood that the introduction of new machines could displace workers in the short term. You know, if a machine can do the work of 10 people, well, those 10 people might suddenly find themselves out of a job. And he acknowledged that that could be a real hardship for those individuals.
But he also argued that if the overall quantity of goods being produced is maintained or even increased, then the increase in net product, the output that's left over after replacing the capital that's been used up, that allows for more investment and eventually for the reemployment of those workers who were initially displaced, it's this kind of long-term view of how the system adjusts.
And he was really pushing back against this idea that technological progress was inherently bad for workers. He saw it as a potential source of greater prosperity for everyone, but he also understood that there could be these painful transitions along the way. And it's worth noting that Ricardo spent a lot of times debating with Thomas Malthus, another influential economist of the era.
Right. They went back and forth on all sorts of things, especially on the role of rent and how demand interacted with the fertility of land to determine prices. They didn't always see eye to eye, to say the least. So, if we're trying to sum up this whole deep dive into Ricardo's principles, I think we can say that he really emphasized a few key ideas. The labor theory of value, the concept of rent as a surplus arising from differences in land quality, this inverse relationship between wages and profits, the way that foreign trade can increase the quantity of goods but not necessarily the total value within a country, the various and often complex impacts of taxation on different parts of the economy, and this really important distinction between value, which is tied to labor cost, and riches, which is simply about the abundance of goods.
And I think what's striking is how many of these ideas, even though they were developed over 200 years ago, are still relevant for understanding economic issues today.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most interesting questions that Ricardo's work raises for us in the present day is this. If he was so focused on labor as the source of value, what would he make of the increasing automation and artificial intelligence that we're seeing all around us? If machines are doing more and more of the work, what does that mean for the value of human labor? It's something to ponder.
It certainly is, and I'd encourage anyone who's really intrigued by these ideas to go back and read Ricardo's principles for themselves.
Hmm.
There's a lot to unpack, and it's not always an easy read, but it's a foundational text for a reason.
Well said. And thank you all for joining us on this deep dives. We'll see you next time.